The stage lights at the Louisiana hayride were hotter than usual that night in the spring of 1952. The crowd had been waiting for over an hour, packed shoulder to shoulder in the humid air of the municipal auditorium in Shreveport. They came for the names they knew, the voices they loved, the kind of Saturday night that made you forget about the cotton fields and the factory shifts and the bills stacked on the kitchen table. But tonight, something felt different. The MC kept stalling. The band kept playing film music. And in the wings, a man stood alone, his back pressed against the wall, his hat pulled low over his eyes, his collar turned up even though the heat was unbearable. His name wasn't on the bill. He hadn't been announced. Most of the audience didn't know he was there, and that was exactly how he needed it to be. Hank Williams had been the biggest name in country music for 3 years running. His voice had carried into living rooms across the South and beyond, through radios that crackled with static, but still delivered the ache in every word he sang. He had written songs that made grown men cry and women clutch their handkerchiefs. He had played the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville, the most sacred stage in country music, and he had been loved there. He had been worshipped there. But that was over now. The Opry had let him go. They didn't fire him outright, they just stopped calling, and everyone knew why. He had shown up drunk one too many times, missed one too many performances, stumbled through one too many songs. The pills he took for the pain in his back had become something else, something darker, something he couldn't control, and Nashville, with all its polish and its rules and its carefully maintained image, had no room for a man who couldn't stand up straight on stage. So they pushed him out quietly, the way you close a door on someone you once loved but can no longer trust. Now he was back in Louisiana, back where he had started, back on the hayride, the stage that had made him before Nashville ever knew his name. But he wasn't the same man who had left, and he knew it. The disguise had been his manager's idea. Or maybe it was his own. He couldn't remember anymore. The days blurred together now. Long stretches of highway and motel rooms and nights where he couldn't tell if he was asleep or awake. But the disguise made sense. A fake mustache, dark glasses, a hat that covered most of his face, a name no one had ever heard before. He would go on stage as someone else, sing a few songs, collect a small paycheck, and disappear before anyone figured it out. It wasn't about pride. It was about survival. He needed the work. He needed the money. But more than that, he needed to know if he could still do it, if the voice was still there, if the songs still mattered when no one knew who was singing them. The MC finally stepped up to the microphone. The crowd settled, the lights dimmed, and the man in the disguise walked slowly toward the edge of the stage, his hands shaking, his breath shallow, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. He hadn't always been this way. There was a time when he walked onto stages like he owned them, like the music was something he carried inside him that couldn't be stopped or slowed or silenced. He had been born with pain, the kind that started in the spine and radiated outward, a condition the doctors said would never go away. But he had learned to live with it. He had learned to turn it into something else, something that poured out of him in 3-minute songs about heartbreak and loneliness and the kind of sorrow that didn't have a name. People heard those songs and felt like he was singing directly to them, like he knew their lives, their struggles, their quiet desperation. And maybe he did. Maybe that was the gift. Or maybe it was the curse. The pills had started as medicine, something to dull the pain so he could stand up long enough to finish. Show. But pain has a way of growing, of demanding more, and the pills stopped working the way they used to. So he took more. And then he took more again. And somewhere along the way, the line between medicine and escape disappeared entirely. The drinking had always been there. A companion on long road trips, a way to calm the nerves before a performance, a way to quiet the noise in his head that never seemed to stop. But now was something else. Now was the thing that got him through the day. and the thing that made sure he couldn't get through the day. Nashville had tried to help him. At first, they sent him to doctors. They gave him time off. They told him to rest, to recover, to come back when he was ready. But Hank Williams wasn't built for rest. He was built for motion, for the next song, the next show, the next crowd. And when the motion stopped, the pain rushed in to fill the space. So he kept moving, and he kept falling. And eventually, Nashville stopped trying. They didn't announce it. They didn't make a scene. They just let him fade, the way you let a photograph sit in the sun until the colors bleed out and the face becomes unrecognizable. The crowd tonight didn't know any of that. They didn't know about the fights with his wife, the custody battle over his son, the nights he spent alone in hotel rooms staring at the ceiling and wondering if this was all there was. They didn't know about the promoters who stopped booking him, the band members who quit, the friends who stopped returning his calls. They didn't know that the man standing in the wings, hidden behind a fake mustache and dark glasses, was one bad night away from disappearing entirely. The MC's voice cut through the noise. He introduced a new act, a singer no one had heard of, someone passing through town, someone who had asked for a chance to play a couple of songs. The crowd clapped politely, the way crowds do when they're waiting for the real show to start. And the man in the disguise stepped into the light. He walked slowly, his gait uneven, his body stiff. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't wave or smile or acknowledge the applause. He just walked to the microphone, adjusted the stand, and wrapped his fingers around it like it was the only thing holding him upright. The band behind him started playing, a slow, mournful progression in a minor key. And then he opened his mouth and began to sing. The voice was unmistakable. Even through the exhaustion, even through the damage, even through the weight of everything he had lost, the voice was still there. It was thinner than it used to be, rougher around the edges, but it carried the same ache, the same raw honesty, the same ability to reach inside a person and pull out feelings they didn't know they had. He sang about a man who had lost everything, who was wandering through life without a home, without hope, without a reason to keep going. He sang about loneliness so deep it felt like drowning, and he sang it like he meant every word. The crowd went quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when people forget where they are, when the music becomes the only thing that matters. A few people in the front rows leaned forward, squinting at the man on stage, trying to see past the disguise, trying to place the voice. But most of them just listened. They listened the way people listen to something true, something that doesn't need explanation or decoration. They listened because the song demanded it. He finished the first song and moved directly into the second without pausing, without speaking, without giving the crowd a chance to react. This one was slower, sadder. A ballad about a love that had slipped away, about a man who knew he was the reason it was gone, but couldn't figure out how to fix it. His voice cracked on the high notes, but it didn't matter. The cracks made it more real. They made it hurt more, and the crowd felt it. Somewhere in the middle of the third row, a woman started, crying. She didn't make a sound, but tears streamed down her face, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. A man beside her put his hand over his mouth, his eyes fixed on the stage, his body completely still. In the back, near the exits, a group of young men who had been talking and laughing a few minutes earlier were now silent. Their heads tilted slightly, their attention locked on the man with the fake mustache and the dark glasses who was singing like his life depended on it. He finished the second song. The crowd applauded, louder this time, longer. A few people stood, a few more whistled. But he didn't acknowledge them. He just nodded once, a small, barely perceptible movement, and stepped back from the microphone. The band kept playing, covering his exit, and he walked off the stage the same way he had walked on, slowly, carefully, like every step took effort. Backstage, he leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. His shirt was soaked through with sweat. His hands were still shaking. He could hear the crowd on the other side of the curtain, still clapping, still calling for more, but he couldn't go back out there. Not yet. Maybe not ever. This became his routine. Week after week, town after town, he would show up in disguise, sing a few songs, and leave before anyone could confirm it was really him. Sometimes he played small clubs where the audience barely paid attention. Sometimes he played honky-tonks where the crowd was too drunk to care. And sometimes, like tonight, he played places where people still loved the music enough to listen, even if they didn't know who was singing it. The disguise wasn't just about hiding. It was about testing something. He wanted to know if the songs could stand on their own, without the name, without the fame, without the machinery of the music industry propping them up. He wanted to know if people would still feel what he felt, if they would still cry or cheer or sit in stunned silence, even if they thought he was. Nobody. And night after night, in town after town, he got his answer. But the disguise was also a kind of prison. It kept him safe, but it kept him isolated. No one could see him, which meant no one could reach him. And as the weeks turned into months, the loneliness that had always been there, the loneliness that fueled his songs, became something unbearable. He would sit alone in motel rooms after shows, staring at himself in the mirror, the fake mustache still glued to his lip, the dark glasses sitting on the nightstand, and he would wonder who he was anymore. Was he Hank Williams, the star who had been cast out? Or was he the man in the disguise, the nobody who sang in small towns for small crowds? Or was he something else entirely, something broken and unfixable, something that didn't belong anywhere? He called his mother one night from a payphone outside a diner in Mississippi. She answered on the third ring, her voice warm and familiar, the only voice in the world that still made him feel like he mattered. He didn't tell her where he was. He didn't tell her about the disguise or the shows or the way his hand shook when he wasn't drinking. He just asked her how she was, if she was eating enough, if she needed anything. She asked him when he was coming home. He said soon. He always said soon. After he hung up, he stood in the parking lot for a long time, watching the cars pass on the highway, their headlights cutting through the dark. He thought about his son, who was too young to understand why his father wasn't around. He thought about his ex-wife, who had tried to save him and finally gave up. He thought about all the people who had loved him and all the people he had let down. And he thought about the songs, the only thing he had left that still felt real. The truth started leaking out slowly, a rumor here, a whisper there. Someone in Baton Rouge said they recognized the voice. Someone in Mobile said they saw him take off the glasses backstage. A journalist in Montgomery wrote a vague column about a mysterious singer who sounded an awful lot like someone who used to be famous. The disguise was crumbling, not because it wasn't good enough, but because the truth always finds a way out. It was in Opelousas, Louisiana, on a rainy Thursday night in late summer, that everything finally broke open. The venue was small, a wooden building with a tin roof that amplified the sound of the rain like a drum. The crowd was sparse, maybe 50 people, most of them locals who had come to hear live music and drink beer and forget about the storm outside. He walked on stage in his usual disguise, the fake mustache slightly crooked, the hat pulled low. The band started playing. He started singing. Halfway through the second song, a man in the front row stood up. He was older, maybe 60, with a weathered face and calloused hands. He had been watching the man on stage closely, his eyes narrowed, his head tilted to one side. And then, without warning, he spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the music. "That's Hank Williams." The room went silent. The band stopped playing. The man on stage froze, his hand still on the microphone, his body rigid. The older man in the front row took a step closer, his eyes locked on the man on stage. "That's Hank Williams," he said again, louder this time, more certain. "I'd know that voice anywhere." The crowd stirred. People leaned forward, craning their necks to get a better look. A few whispered to each other. A few stood. The man on stage didn't move. He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it. He just stood there, exposed. The disguise suddenly meaningless. The older man's face softened. His voice dropped, quieter now, almost gentle. "Why are you hiding, son?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. The man on stage looked down at the floor, his shoulders slumping, his breath shallow. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know if there was anything to say. For months, he had hidden behind the disguise, behind the anonymity, behind the illusion that he could be someone else. But the truth was, he had been hiding long before the mustache and the glasses. He had been hiding from the pain, from the failure, from the fear that he had lost the only thing that made him matter. The older man took another step forward. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't angry. He just looked like someone who had seen enough of life to recognize suffering when he saw it. "We know who you are," he said quietly, "and we still want to hear you sing." Something broke inside the man on stage. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. It wasn't a breakdown. It was quieter than that, more fragile. It was the sound of a man realizing that the thing he had been running from was the thing he needed most. He reached up slowly and pulled off the dark glasses. Then he peeled away the fake mustache, wincing as the glue pulled at his skin. He took off the hat and let it fall to the floor. And he stood there, fully himself, fully exposed, his face pale and drawn, his eyes red and tired. The crowd didn't gasp. They didn't cheer. They just looked at him, and in their eyes there was no judgment, no condemnation, no disgust. There was only recognition. They saw a man who had been broken by the world, by his choices, by circumstances beyond his control, and they saw someone who was still trying, still fighting, still standing on a stage in a small town in Louisiana because the music was the only thing he had left. A woman in the third row started clapping. It was slow at first, deliberate, the kind of applause that isn't about celebration but about solidarity. Another person joined her, then another. And then the entire room was clapping, not because he was famous, not because he was Hank Williams, but because he was human, and they understood. He stood there for a long moment, his chest tight, his throat thick with something he couldn't name. And then he stepped back up to the microphone, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," he said. It was all he could manage. He sang one more song that night, no disguise, no pretense, just the voice, raw and unguarded, carrying a melody about redemption that he wasn't sure he believed in but sang anyway, because maybe someone else needed to hear it. When he finished, the applause was deafening, but he barely heard it. He just nodded once, picked up his hat from the floor, and walked off the stage. The news spread quickly after that. Within days, everyone knew. Hank Williams had been singing in disguise for months, not because he was ashamed, but because he was desperate. Desperate to keep singing, desperate to keep living, desperate to find out if the music still mattered when everything else had fallen apart. The newspapers ran stories. The radio stations talked about it. And the fans, the people who had loved him from the beginning, didn't turn away. They didn't abandon him. They cried. Not because he had been hiding, but because they understood why he had to. He didn't make it much longer after that. The damage was too deep, the pain too great, the weight too heavy. On New Year's Day, 1953, Hank Williams died in the back seat of a Cadillac on a lonely highway in West Virginia. He was 29 years old, but in those final months, when he stood on stages in disguise and sang like his life depended on it, he had proven something that no one could take away. The music was bigger than the name. The truth was stronger than the disguise. And sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is let themselves be seen, even when they were broken, even when they're afraid, even when they don't know if they'll be loved or rejected, The man in Opelousas who had recognized him, who had called him out in front of the crowd, never forgot that night. He told the story for years, always the same way, always with the same quiet reverence. He would say that he didn't see a fallen star on that stage. He saw a man who had lost everything and still found the strength to sing. And that, he would say, was the bravest thing he had ever witnessed. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.